Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the JCC of Mid-Westchester's Arts and Talks series. I'm Stephanie Balkin, the Director of Arts and Talks and Adult Programs at the JCC. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for this very special and timely program, Sisters-in-Law Working for Justice in Today's Society with Mimi Rocah and Maya Wiley. Arts and Talks brings arts, culture, and conversation to the heart of Westchester. And even though we can't be together in person right now, we're still building our community by doing engaging virtual programming. In fact, it's because of patrons like yourselves that we're able to bring such high quality program such as this to Scarsdale, to Westchester, and now into your homes. I hope that you'll consider supporting our work. We've been providing these programs complimentary during the pandemic. JCC of Mid-Westchester does such important work, including working with aging in place seniors and working with special needs children and adults, in addition to all of the arts and cultural programming. You can visit our website for more information, and we hope we can count on you for your generosity. Just some notes before I introduce our esteemed guests. You're all muted, but you can put your questions into the Q&A. We hope that we'll be able to answer as many questions as possible during our 45 minutes to 50 minutes together. We are so excited and now to introduce our esteemed panelists. It is a real privilege to have this sisterhood of formidable legal minds with us here today. Two of the most respected voices out there pursuing justice in so many areas, from Me Too, domestic violence during COVID, anti-Semitic and other hate crimes, to racial injustice and beyond. Let me tell you a little bit about Mimi and Maya. Mimi Rocah is a Chicago native and has been living in Scarsdale, our home area, for over 10 years. She's a 16-year federal prosecutor who ran the Westchester office for the Department of Justice under President Obama. She's a Pace University School of Law criminal justice fellow, and a former legal analyst for MSNBC and NBC. Mimi has a special connection to the JCC of Mid-Westchester. She's been so grateful over the years for the cultural and social leadership that the JCC has provided to our community. Her daughter has attended our JCC Summer Arts Center summer camp. Her daughter has done swim lessons at the JCC, and her family has attended several JCC cultural programs. Thank you so much, Mimi, for being here. Maya Wiley is one of the preeminent civil rights activists in America today. She is the professor of public and urban policy at the New School University. She's also the former counsel to New York City Mayor de Blasio. Maya is the former board chair of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board. She's a civil rights attorney. She was a civil rights attorney at ACLU and the Legal Defense Fund, and she's the former U.S. Assistant District Attorney in the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. Maya can be seen regularly serving as a legal analyst and sharing her insights on MSNBC and on NBC News. Thank you so much for being here, both of you. Thank you. And now, without further ado, please help me welcome the Sisters-in-Law Working for Justice. Maya, why don't we start with you? When we planned this event many months ago, I think close to 6 months ago, there were several topics that we were very eager to discuss. But with the news rapidly changing every day and in light of the current situation, let's start with the topics that are most top of mind right now. Can you give us some opening thoughts about how you view the current state of affairs in our country today and what's going on in the world around us?
I will absolutely do that. But first, I want to thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's really a pleasure to be here with my sister-in-law, Mimi Rocah, who I miss sitting next to on panels at MSNBC, who I used to get to see all the time, and whose children I have had the great fortune to I can't say I've watched them grow, but I have no doubt that it would be really fun to see them in the programs. So let me start with a sort of obvious observation, which is that we are in a transformative moment. It's a critical moment for the country, but it's one that is demonstrating how demonstration is a transformative democratic practice that elevates both problems that are not being sufficiently addressed by policymakers by local leaders, by a variety of players in the government on the governmental side of things, and proposes and starts to ask for changes and reforms. And we have seen some of those take root very, very quickly. And I'm sure we'll talk about more of those later. I don't want to go into detail about them right now. But the other thing I want to add is, I'm going to use the term movement times, that these are movement times. And here's what I mean by that. Demonstration itself, direct action, is a form of movement activity, but not every time we have demonstrations means we're in a movement moment. What makes it a movement, like the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, is the fact that people who are not necessarily directly impacted get involved, get in the street too. I mean, and that's what we saw. We saw it before. I don't think it was our first indicator. I mean, we saw it actually in Washington, D.C. in January of 2017, when we saw one of the largest marches in the history of the country, made up of women concerned about women's rights. But this is another moment of both seeing so many people who are, of course, Black and of course Latino, but also white, Asian, people showing up angry, upset, demanding change because they say Black Lives Matter. And of course, it's not only people who are Black who are subject to police abuse, and we should be very clear on that. But it's certainly true that we are 2.5 times more likely to be victims of police violence if we're Black, and 2 times more likely to be victims of police violence if we're Latino. And so the fact that so many people who are less directly impacted, not impacted, but less directly impacted, are also coming out day after day all over the country, really underscores that this is touching a nerve. And the fact that we've seen poll numbers shift so radically, there was a time not that long ago in 2018 where the general public would rate the police as maybe the 3rd most trusted institution in the country. Now, there were huge amounts of racial division, obviously, in those views. You would not hear that necessarily at the same rate from people who are Black. But that has changed dramatically. Now we're seeing polling that says 76% of Americans say that race discrimination in policing is a significant problem. So that kind of coming to consciousness is also coming to movement. And I think the most important thing to hold on to here is this is about transformation to make things better for all of us. And all of us have been showing up in it, no matter where we live, no matter what our race or religion, no matter our background, and no matter our direct experience with policing. People are showing up and saying something is really wrong here and it's got to get fixed.
Thank you for that opening remarks. Mimi, please share your thoughts.
Yes, so you probably may have seen me sitting here nodding vigorously, which is what I do every time, frankly, I'm next to Maya anywhere. And I just want to say, though, I know, this is a hard time. It's both a hopeful time, as Maya said, but also a hard time. And we did plan this long ago. And I know Maya has just been nonstop, both on TV, doing work, and it's an emotional time. And I'm so grateful that she's here with us. And frankly, I would be happy just to sit here and nod and listen to her, because I really think, I've always listened to her, but I think now more than ever, quite frankly, white people like me need to listen. That's what we need to do right now. And there's no one I'd rather listen to than Maya, because she's both compassionate and wise and passionate all at the same time. So I'm going to do a lot of listening, but I'll just add to, of course, what Maya said, because I agree with all of it. What I am seeing, as someone who did work in law enforcement, frankly, for, over 16 years, something that I see that's really different, the things that Maya said, first of all, that we have groups of people in the streets who never would have been there before, frankly, or weren't. We had a rally here in Scarsdale the other night on Sunday that hundreds of people came to. And it was organized by high school students who were not only articulate, but really bold in the way that they spoke. They're not afraid to call out the truths and say things that I think adults are a little uncomfortable with still, even in this moment, but need to be said, which is part of why, as usual, the young people are helping to lead this. They invited the mayor from Mount Vernon, Mayor Sean Patterson Howard, and other people from Mount Vernon. And they said, look, we're inviting them because honestly, we don't have any Black elected officials here in Scarsdale. And it wasn't just that they did it, it was that they explained why. And they talked about, we go to some of the best schools in the country, but we aren't learning enough Black history. So these are things that have never really, I'm not saying they've never been said out loud before, but they're being said in a different way, in a more explicit way, and more accepted when they're said. And then the other piece of this that I've noticed since George Floyd's murder is the willingness of law enforcement, the almost, I won't say unanimous, because I'm sure there's plenty out there that aren't, but at least here in Westchester, the ones I have personally spoken to, I have many friends here in Westchester who are police chiefs, who are in law enforcement. They are just as moved by this moment. And we actually had a rally last week in White Plains that the Guardians, and I helped them organize it. The Guardians are Blacks in law enforcement, both retired and current. And it was called The Right Side of Justice. And it was aimed to bring in law enforcement to a rally, to show up and show that they were standing with the protesters. And they did. Police chiefs from all across this county, even police union presidents showed up. And it was very moving. I've never seen that kind of showing up by law enforcement on a problem that is about reforming and addressing problems in law enforcement. So I think those two things are quite remarkable.
So let's go a little bit deeper into that. We're seeing in the wake of George Floyd's murder, this emergence of even a global movement. So we have it on the local level, the country level, the state level, and then here we see it globally. Maya, you alluded it to before. You said that speaking about what's different about this is how many people are getting involved who are not directly impacted, let's say. Can you talk a little bit more about why this movement is a little bit different, and what do you expect some of the things that will be changing in response to this?
Yeah, I think, one thing to recognize is, which is true of all movements. I'll go back to the civil rights movement as example. They're not, the mushrooming, and the expansion of people who have sympathy or empathy and join movements who are not necessarily directly impacted, come after a whole lot of other people have done a whole lot of work. And, I think the role that Black Lives Matter has played, starting with the killing of Trayvon Martin, which was not by a police officer, but was by someone who wanted to be a police officer, tried to be, and was a gated community guard, basically. But the part of the nerve that touched, and the orientation and the development of Black Lives Matter as a movement around violence against people of color, particularly Black people, it was a long time trend. It wasn't new. If we went back to Rodney King in 1992, who was brutally beaten on video by LAPD, by a large number of LAPD officers. That was a traumatizing video to watch too. He was fortunately not killed, but so brutally beaten when he was on the ground. And yet those police officers were acquitted of the obvious excessive force that they had used against him. And so, the reality is, in the Black community, this has been a huge issue, from racial profiling by police to police violence for generations. And and particularly since 1992, because video and the increase of video has both been useful as an organizing tool for folks to recognize just how pervasive this experience can be. And I think the fact that over the past 4 or 5 years, we've had video after video after video, and in each instance, virtually no justice. for what we have seen in those videos, which has made, I think it's really laid bare for Americans who have no reason to distrust the police and no reason to necessarily understand this experience to say, okay, now just it's impossible not to think something is wrong. And I think it's also a generational in the sense that young people have been really at the forefront of driving these demands through the Black Lives Matter movement, but through, you know, as Mimi said, I think that was such a powerful story referencing how high school students themselves were taking this on and saying, we're white and we're privileged and we get it. So we want to have a different conversation. We want to learn differently. So there is something generationally happening. And, you know, I'm not a sociologist, so I can't really say, you know, what those shifts are. Some of it may be our demographics are changing this country. And as, you know, people of color there's no one, we're coming to a place where there's no one race that is going to be dominant in number. But the question is one race going to be dominant in privilege? And I think we've seen a generation of people across races saying, you know, there really shouldn't be. And understanding and thinking about how rooted this is. But the policing and the police misconduct really shines a light on what those disparities are, why they exist, why we can look at who's doing well and who's not based on group, you know, based on race, based on what people look like and geography. If you look at the data on both police complaints, and I can say this specifically for New York City, but this is also true in other areas, you can pinpoint places on a map that have the majority of complaints, and they are low-income communities of color. And there are reasons for that. Some of which don't have anything to do with policing, the larger issues of how we have structured race into society. And this generation is asking those questions and wondering why they're not getting taught, as Mimi said, that history, but also why nobody is pointing to and asking for changes in some of the decisions that we make that reproduce that every single day, even if it's not with intent to pull down opportunity. And so, you know, when I look at this, I see generational shifts, I see demographic shifts, but I also see, you know, the way that both technology has connected us better and made more visible what could be invisible for some. And I think that has been powerful.
Thank you, Maya. So Mimi, maybe you can speak a little bit to this. How can we build bridges between the police and the communities that they're sworn to serve? And also, what are some of the reforms that you think need to happen in order to change the system? And how do we go about doing that? Is that state legislation, federal legislation? Can you shed some light on that, please?
Yes, I mean there's a lot in that question.
Yes,
let me start with the bridges. You know, I think quite honestly, it's going to be hard. I mean, no one should think that there's any quick fix to. I'll use the word rebuilding, but maybe I even just need to say building, because I don't know if it was ever there with many communities, quite honestly. The trust between police and the communities they serve. You know, but I think there are things we can do. And as I referenced in the beginning, again, the fact that police and law enforcement, not all of them, but many of them, right? We saw us in New York City, many of them walking with the protesters. I mean, frankly, that is probably the first and foremost thing that will help is people seeing law enforcement acknowledging that there's a problem. And it's needs to be said out loud by law enforcement. I've said before, as a former member of law enforcement, I've been, you know, calling on current and former members of law enforcement to use their voice and say, we too understand that there needs, I mean, they don't have to say it in the same way. They can say it in whatever way they're comfortable with, but acknowledging that there's a problem that needs to be fixed is part, I think, of what will help build that bridge. There's a lot of calls, I think I agree with, to go back to a model of community policing, which will help build a bridge. That is probably it doesn't mean it's the only way to correctly police, but it's certain. In other words, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. But we really got away from community policing in this country because we started going more to a model based on CompStat and statistics. And statistics and data is important, but we also need to rebuild the idea of having police in the community who know them, where you can literally build relationships and trust. That's part of how you do it. I also think people seeing law enforcement in general and the police in particular being more transparent will help. I mean, right now, one of the things that happened after George Floyd was murdered, and I thought, this was just not handled well by law enforcement there, is not only did it take over 4 days to bring charges in the first place, charges that once they were brought, pretty obviously could have been brought just based on the videotape. So what was going on in those 4 days? Well, then we learned they got an autopsy that then came out with this kind of victim blaming statement about, maybe him having underlying medical conditions and possible COVID exposure. It was almost like they were giving a chance for him, for the officers to see if there was a defense there. That's at least how it looked. So whatever the intent, and then you have the district attorney there, who eventually the case was removed from, basically. You had the district attorney come out and make statements that were very unclear. He said, well, before any charges were brought, he said, well, there's some evidence that points to them, not being guilty. What? I mean, that was after, I think, like on day 2. And that fueled the protests, understandably. You cannot, in those positions, not be transparent. Either say nothing if that's really all you're going to do, or be really transparent. But saying things like that is just not helpful, I think. So I think it's community policing, it's law enforcement saying out loud that there's a problem, even if they don't have all the answers yet. Just acknowledge that there's problems you're willing to work on, and then being more transparent in the communications about things like this, which hopefully will not keep happening, but if and when even smaller things do, being more transparent about it.
We've had several people ask us this: what can we actually do in our local communities to affect real change? There's a lot of talk, people talking about it, which is wonderful, and the dialogue is fantastic, but what are some tangible things that people can do in our own communities to combat structural racism and inequality and injustice? I think the example in our own neighborhood in Scarsdale of the students putting this protest and vigil together is so key. But what else can we do? I think people really feel the desire to do something. Maya, can you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, so it's such an important question, and I just want to stop on it for a minute and say, one of the things that's so important about it is it got asked. I mean, that in and of itself is a really wonderful indicator that we're in a much better place. And so I really appreciate that question. I mean, I think the short answer is there's several things, and Mimi has said a number of them, so I'm just going to kind of take and agree with everything she said and kind of drill them down. One is there has to be a discussion with the police department about its being more accountable to community. And that, so community policing as a label is something that needs drilling down on, not because the concept is wrong, but because different police departments mean different things when they say community policing. And so one thing that local community can do is actually say, here's what we mean by it. Here's the partnership that we want. And to the extent that any community has a diverse community, really using that to create relationships with other parts of the community, particularly the ones that might be more deeply impacted, to say, what do you want? What can we do to be in partnership with you around problems that you're seeing and changes that you need? Because we can go to the police department together. I mean, most police departments have a kind of a community council, and using those vehicles to start those conversations about what are the problems that the community sees, both in terms of whatever law enforcement issues that they want police to prioritize, and also what are the issues that shouldn't be for law enforcement, that they say, you know, this is one where we have problems and you don't actually have to be in this, and we could actually think of alternatives. I think the other is the accountability side in terms of discipline. And Mimi talked about accountability. The reality is we've just had a sea change in New York State by the state legislature finally, as a result of George Floyd's death, by the way, because advocates have been asking for this since Eric Garner's death in New York City in 2014, that the state has a law that says that law enforcement gets protections around their personnel files that no other public servant gets. I mean, fire and corrections and police. When I worked for the city, if I had any discipline, any reporter could ask for it and be given my file, but you could not do the same thing with regard to police. And I promise you, I had a lot less ability to do physical harm to anyone than the police. That law has now changed. It has been, and so that means there's more opportunity for transparency. But here's the question. It means we can get the data, but how are citizens, because this is what citizenship is. I'm not talking about documented status. I mean, the practice of being engaged means understanding what that data is and holding police departments accountable for whether in fact they are disciplining police when they do wrong. Because what we know is, and that this is what we saw in Officer Derek Chauvin's case, the officer whose knee was directly on the neck of George Floyd, is that he had 18 complaints of abusive behavior. And one of them, just to give you an example, was he pulled a gun, allegedly, on a group of young white men, because a Nerf ball that they were playing with hit someone. He pulled a gun on them. And they had, the young man that filed the complaint had no way of knowing what his discipline was. Now, Minneapolis made an important legal shift in creating an open portal after another police killing, I think back in 2016, to make available police disciplinary records online. We haven't done that in New York State yet, right? We've just repealed this law. So how are we making sure communities can see and track what's happening with discipline? So it's not enough just to say you can ask for it. You have to be able to see it, get it easily. So communities can ask for that so they can have better oversight with their police department.
Great. Mimi, do you want to speak to that a little bit about what we can do as a community?
Well, I mean, I think a big part of what we can do, as Maya was saying, and you know, frankly, there's a long list, is lobby, advocate for changes in legislation. I mean, a lot, you know, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket and only rely on legislation, because this is so much bigger than that. I think both Maya and I have been saying that, and everyone gets that. It's more than just about legislation. It's about a culture change. It's about reimagining how the police do their job, or what job they do, and how prosecutors do their job, and how we hold people accountable. But legislation does have a big role. So as Maya mentioned, you know, we just had 50A repealed here. That, as Maya knows better than anybody, you know, no one really thought that was going to happen, certainly not this swiftly. So that's enormous, and will inherently now bring along a whole other number of changes. Will we see an online database? What is it? How will the information be disclosed? What will be the details around it? And that's going to be a very, very big part of it. Some of the things that we're hearing talked about both at the federal level and at the state and even the county level are these sort of universal databases about police officers, so that if a police officer is you know, suspended from one force or fired, whatever the terminology is, from one department, they don't get to move to another one and get hired, and nobody knows, you know, what their history was, because that's happening right now a lot, and that's a big problem too. Someone does get removed from one department, they then get hired by another department, and both because of 50A and all sorts of other reasons, nobody knows the history of why they were removed from one department. I mean, that obviously makes no sense when you think about that, just when you thought about any other industry in the world, let alone the police, who are carrying around guns and dealing with very high pressure sensitive situations. So that's another one. I think, there's pending legislation, both federally and I believe it already exists in New York, though Maya can correct me if I'm wrong, about banning chokeholds. That seems like, to me, a very obvious, necessary step, and I've heard many law enforcement people speaking out, and former law enforcement about that. Then there's qualified immunity issues. Are we going to be able to change those, which largely shield police officers and other public officials from accountability? There's the question, and I'd be very curious to hear what Maya thinks about this. I know some people, and I've suggested looking into possibly changing the standard for which we hold a police law enforcement accountable for excessive use of force. Right now, it's basically a reasonableness standard. If it was reasonable for them to use force, that maybe we should think about at least. I'm not saying right now here we should do it. I'm saying we should think about, should it be a higher standard, that it has to be a last resort or absolutely necessary? Which obviously, in the example that Maya said, pulling a gun on somebody for throwing a Nerf ball, would not qualify. I mean, it wouldn't qualify under any standard. But that's something Maya and I have not talked about, but I'd be curious about, because we are talking about accountability. So those are just some examples, and we could even find a way maybe to send. There's a whole long list of legislation that people are considering, and I do think, while again, that's not the only piece, it's a very important piece for the citizenry to inform themselves about and get involved in talking to their elected officials about.
Mimi, can I jump in on and just come back to, so one, I think we have to look at standards, absolutely, and how we're holding officers accountable. And by the way, if anyone is curious, one of the gold standards on excessive force from a police department standpoint is Camden, New Jersey, that has an 18-page description, basically doing the opposite of what most police departments do and being very explicit about what is okay and what is not okay and when in terms of the use of force. And it's been helpful. But I wanted to come back to you because you said a lot that really goes to prosecutorial discretion. And you are an extremely effective, extremely seasoned prosecutor. And so I'm wondering in this conversation, because what you had said earlier, what really noted how it's a system. It's not just policing. It's also whether the police are policed, and that's prosecutors. And it's also how prosecutors are using their discretion. So you gave the example here in the case of George Floyd. It was also Ahmaud Arbery, where it had to go up to the state to finally get prosecutors who would treat the case appropriately and actually arrest the vigilantes, one of whom was a former police officer. So can you talk a little bit about where and how you see the role of prosecutorial discretion here and what kind of leadership we need to think about from that perspective as well?
Yeah, I mean, so, first of all, there's two pieces to this. One is prosecutors using their discretion and aggressively pursuing cases against police officers when warranted. And then there's also the piece of prosecutors being held accountable. Prosecutors are not perfect. And oftentimes, I think that gets lost in the conversation, that it's not just about changing the police, it's about changing how prosecutors do their job and how they're held accountable. And there was legislation for a prosecutorial oversight commission that actually passed, and Governor Cuomo signed it. A court found it basically unconstitutional, so now it's not in existence, but I'm sure that will be coming back in some new form. And I do think it's important because just as we don't want the police policing themselves, I don't think we can rely on prosecutors alone to police themselves. Prosecutors in every area, not just when it comes to police, as do have immense power and immense discretion. And the question is, when are you going to aggressively pursue cases and when are you going to pull back? That's discretion. That is about using that power. And in my mind, if we're talking about a police officer having used some kind of force, which could rise to the level of excessive force, or certainly where someone has died, you need to be, as a prosecutor, that's the time when you should be the aggressive prosecutor. That doesn't mean you're trying to prosecute innocent people. It means you're using every investigative tool, you're taking every precaution to not sort of go out of your way to protect the police, which is what it looked like with George Floyd when they didn't bring the charges and then made these victim blaming type statements. The power of the prosecutor should be used, and the reason is not because we're out to get police officers. The reason is because we trust police officers and other public officials. This is true for elected officials as well. Anyone in public office. As you know, Maya, in the federal system, there's actually an enhancement in the guidelines called abuse of public trust. So anyone who holds a governmental type of position, a public office, if they commit a crime using that power of their office, they basically are eligible to get an enhanced sentence, because abusing the public trust is almost like a sort of separate crime in and of itself. It's considered such a bad thing, and so that's the way that as a former federal prosecutor I look at this, is that when we are examining the conduct of elected officials, of public officials, of police officers, people in whom the public puts their trust, that is when prosecutors need to be most thorough and most diligent in trying to hold people accountable.
I just want to point out, because I loved what you said, and I was on Morning Joe this morning with a prosecutor from Florida, and the question came up in this context about, how this shapes the perceptions of prosecutors. I'm paraphrasing. But what was so interesting is, I was thinking about our experience here, because we one of the things that needs to happen with reform, just going back to your question about, what can local communities do, is prosecutorial discretion is something that communities can talk to their elected prosecutors about. Because, in New York, what we've seen in New York City, what we have seen is one prosecutor, Ken Thompson, who's now unfortunately passed away, but as a reform prosecutor, said 86% of these low-level marijuana possession cases that you, the police department, are bringing to my office are Black and Latino. 86%. In a borough where there are tons of white people who smoke. So this is an enforcement problem that has disparities, and it's low level. We're not talking about trafficking and drugs. We're talking about people smoking a joint. So put aside what you think about people smoking a joint, and he wasn't taking a position on whether that was good or bad, but he was saying this is not an appropriate use of police resources. It's creating criminal records and creating cases and using public resources where I'm not even sure policing is the right thing. So he just said, I'm just not going to prosecute them. He's like, you can bring them to me, but I'm not going to prosecute them. And that's one of the things that advocates are asking for in this moment, is some of these really low-level offenses, like George Floyd with the thing that he supposedly had done, which we don't even know if he did, was pass a $20 bill. Ahmaud Arbery, the thing that he supposedly did was trespassing, went onto a property that was under construction to look at it. Turned out it's because he was studying to be an electrician and he was curious how they were doing it. But the point is, unless we start taking away these very low-level offenses, we're going to have more negative, police interactions on things that are not that important. But prosecutors have a lot of discretion to say to the police department, some of these things you shouldn't be bringing to me.
So we have a lot of questions coming in, and one of the things I think would be remiss if we didn't speak a little bit about what else is going on in the world, which is coronavirus and COVID and the pandemic, and how that situation is actually laying bare as well racial inequality. And also we talked earlier before our call about, the situation with domestic violence happening during this time and people being hunkered down at home. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, that is a huge area of conversation right now as well, please.
Mimi, why don't you start with that, because that domestic violence has been such a big issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I've worked with My Sister's Place, which is one of the leading domestic violence service organizations here in Westchester, but really across New York, and also Pace Women's Justice Center. And so I've been very much sort of on paying attention to what they've been saying and doing over these past few months. And the bottom line is that it's been nothing short of just a real crisis. I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense in a horrible way that when we all were, told stay home to be safe, staying home for so many people meant being literally locked in with abusers, people who had been abusive before, and also, and there's just no getting around this situation, the stress of it, the economics of it, everything about the situation has triggered something. And I'm not making excuses for them, but there's no question that it has made people who possibly weren't abusive before actually be abusive. And so the question very quickly became, how do we get lifelines to victims who previously already through difficult circumstances, but were able to call hotlines, were able to make the visits to places like My Sister's Place and other service organizations. And, so the governor actually did issue an executive order establishing like a text hotline, which is helpful, but how to implement that is still difficult. And also, again, not every domestic violence victim has a phone that they have free access to. We also saw the courts, the New York State courts, issue stays on orders of protection, basically. So any order of protection that was set to expire during COVID automatically would not expire, which is a good thing. But I think that there are, this is the time where we all in our community have to be, just as citizens, really on the lookout, right? Because it's that old, if you see something, say something, but more than ever, because it often now would be the case that victims really can't say something. And, we need people, and this is something that I think maybe police departments could work on, could have, like, for example, people at pharmacies who work at pharmacies, because that's one of the few places where victims and all of us, have been allowed to go during COVID. Be on the lookout for signs of things, because they might be able to say, hey, are you okay? And while that might feel intrusive, it might just be something for now that we need to do. And if they say they're okay, you back off. We also need to think about getting phones to people who might not have them, prepaid phones, maybe. We did this many, many years ago in New York City when domestic violence first sort of started coming into the consciousness more, where we gave, I was actually at the New York City Police Department at the time, and we gave out flip phones. This was like in the 90s when people still used those to call 911. Now it would be prepaid phones that people can text on, if there is a way to think of it. So there's different ideas we should be thinking about, not just for this crisis, but going forward to help victims have access. But it has obviously disproportionately affected, I shouldn't say obviously, but it's clear is what I mean, disproportionately affected communities here in Westchester. Certainly we've seen that, both because of environmental issues, lack of access to healthcare, and then also the domestic violence problem.
Maya, do you want to speak to that a little bit as well? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that Mimi covered so much important territory so well. I would sitting here thinking about how we've been discussing racial disparities in COVID, and it's everything from, we were talking about this in terms of policing too, and it's really the very similar root causes, right? The root causes of poverty, the root causes of being less mobile in terms of where you can live because of discrimination. This is something the Jewish community has a long history of as well, right? The ghetto is a shared experience for us, whether we're Black or Jewish, being told where we can and cannot live and what we can and cannot do. And it's still very much a present day reality for people who are Black, both in terms of housing discrimination that is unfortunately still a very real and present problem and then accelerated as well by affordability as a problem. But part of what that means is the conditions in community, like overcrowded housing, like so therefore no social distancing, like the fact that if you are in a community of color, you're much more likely, I mean, that's identifiable as a community of color by demographics. You are more likely to be living in a place with degraded air quality because environmental insults get placed in your community, which makes you more susceptible to the ravages of COVID, which is a respiratory, fundamentally, you know, and in its most dangerous form becomes a respiratory issue. And, you know, just like people who are Black are 2.5 times more likely to be victims of police violence, we're twice as likely to die from cancer. We have 3 to 4 times the rate of mortality in childbirth. And a lot of these statistics are not with regard to income. They have everything to do with place and condition of investment and of opportunity. So, you know, I think so I just wanted to kind of, because so much of what Mimi said, I think is kind of wrapped in the same problem of how we construct community and how we make investments. And a lot of what both these pandemics, the pandemic of COVID-19 and the pandemic of police violence when it comes to communities of color, really have the same shared root causes. And that means that we should pay a lot more attention to those root causes.
Great. Thank you. I think it's a really important issue. There's so many important issues to be discussing now, but we are running short on time. I'd love to hear some final thoughts from each of you about what we can do, which we've discussed a little bit, but your message, what is hopeful? What do you find hopeful in all of this? And where do you think we'll be in a few months' time? Maya.
Well, I will repeat my hope. You know, my hope, which I define in Kierkegaardian terms, right? Kierkegaard said, hope is a passion for what is possible. And I think we're in a very passionate moment, which means a moment of great possibility. And the reforms, legislative, but also at local level, in terms of relationship, in terms of coming together and finding more common ground across community, as we've seen in these demonstrations, are tremendously hopeful. And I think in the weeks to come, we're going to see both more reform. We've seen already a really impressive beginning. And I think we're going to see a really deepening conversation about transformation and what it requires, particularly because of our twin pandemics and because our current context is calling all of us to be solution-oriented, and it's calling all of us to see the solutions as ones that need to serve all of us and that we have to get there together. So I'm very hopeful for that, and I'm very thankful for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Mimi.
Yeah, I mean, I think both, you know, Maya and I both touched on this at the beginning and now at the end, that the hope comes from seeing the coalition, if you will, of people who are responding, right? It's not, as Maya said at the beginning, and now I'm going to repeat this wherever I go because it makes so much sense to me. It is not just the people who are impacted by these bad behaviors and policies. It's everyone saying, wait a minute, this is wrong, even if it doesn't affect me. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we see in Scarsdale having a rally. That's what I was in Mamaroneck yesterday. I mean, all over the place. You know, again, seeing people in law enforcement, I hope they continue to use their voice, and anyone who knows police officers, and, you know, talk to them about it. I mean, it's interesting to me how when I say to them, you know, how do you feel about this? Well, I felt nauseated watching the tape. Okay, well, you need to say that out loud. People should hear you say that. And I don't think that had occurred to them, you know, so encouraging people to use their voice and speak up who might not have before. All of that does give me hope. You know, I don't want to be naive about it. There's going to be forces who are going to try to politicize this, who are going to push back on it, who are going to try to use it for political purposes. And that's something we need to be careful of too. You know, that it doesn't get turned into that, because it's about so much more than that. It should be. it's so much else. I shouldn't even say more. It's not about politics. It's about humanity. And that's where we are. But most of all, as I said at the beginning, you know, I, as a white woman, a privileged white woman, am pledging to listen more than ever before, because I think that is so important. And I hope that we can all do that.
Thank you both so much for your insights and for giving us the time during this incredibly busy news cycle. We really respect and honor everything that you've said. It really means a lot to us that you spend time with Arts and Talks. For the rest of you, thank you so much for being here. We have some fantastic upcoming events this summer, so please stay tuned. And next week we have a book talk on Cinema Judaica and then a virtual tour of the Jewish Museum. In the meantime, you can stay in touch with us at jccmw.org/artstalks. And we really think that this conversation is really a jumping off point for what we can do in our local communities to educate our children, to educate our parents, and to educate ourselves about what's going on in the world today. So thank you all so much again. Thank you all for being here. We look forward to seeing you again in the future. Be well. Thank you. Stay well, stay safe.
Bye.
Bye.